Which came first, the drawing or the dead game designer? This is unironically a question I've been bouncing around in my head for days at this point, as I try to unravel not one, not two, but 4 different cornerstones of evidence that may change how you look at the Five Nights at Freddy's series. Well, at least some of these games and books. All of this to answer a question I mentioned in my timeline video, that being, how does Michael Afton know what Nightmare Fredbear looks like if he's not the one who had the nightmares in FNAF 4? What I found spun me across different short stories, games, and plenty of fan theories to try and reason how this could be. But that was just the tip of the iceberg, because once I got digging, I got stuck in the rabbit hole. I'll be real, folks watching, I'm not so sure Michael actually knows what Nightmare Fredbear looks like at all. Or at least, the real Nightmare Fredbear. So, let's begin. My research started in the most obvious places I could find, those being the survival logbook and FNAF 4, the 2 obvious connective fibers of this whole mystery. As we see in the survival logbook, when prompted by this faint text on one of the pages asking about his dreams, Michael, in his red pen he's been using throughout the book, draws a picture of Nightmare Fredbear. Well, Nightmare Fredbear minus his hat, which kinda just makes him look like an old geezer. Since we know the nightmare animatronics aren't real, either because they're literal nightmares, figments of imagination, or the product of illusion discs, it stands to reason that Michael has to be the one we play as in FNAF 4, since technically speaking, they're the only one who could know what they look like, right? Wrong. As we see in FNAF's character encyclopedia, it's referenced at several different points that the character we see in FNAF 4's main gameplay is meant to be the crying child, Michael's younger brother. Hell, Scott even commissioned artwork of CC and Nightmare together. I doubt he'd commission that on accident. So that led to a major conundrum, and one that I knew had some very simple answers that I didn't want to rely too heavily on. The first answer was that it was a retcon. Scott decided it made more sense for Michael to have had those nightmares, and thus he made it so, but ended up going back on this by the time of the character encyclopedia. The other, harder to prove answer was that the survival logbook wasn't canon at all. This one is much harder to prove because this logbook gave us the name Cassidy as our Golden Freddy, a name which has cropped up a couple times since then. If I was gonna solve this, I needed more. Some kind of smoking gun. So I asked myself another question. Michael knowing what Nightmare Fredbear looks like is difficult enough, but how about this? How does Silver Parasol know what Nightmare Fredbear looks like? One question people often don't ask when trying to solve the Mike vs. CC mystery is how many other people who technically shouldn't know what the nightmares look like, know what they look like. Looking into it, this makes Help Wanted specifically come across as very strange. In Help Wanted, we see appearances from pretty much all of the Nightmare animatronics, with the exception of Nightmare Mangle. But then, how does this game studio know what Crying Child, or hell, Mike's nightmares look like? The short answer? They don't. They just make their best guess. I'm sure many of you know by now, but the FNAF VR experience is not a wholly original product in-universe. Being FNAF's sort of soft reboot, the timeline changed up a bit as a result. But by how much? It's now that I feel I need to bring up the game Help Wanted, and the short story, Help Wanted. Yeah, they have the same name, but this is proof enough in my eyes that they're meant to inform one another. To very briefly sum up the short story Help Wanted, Steve Snodgrass is an indie game developer who mostly makes family-friendly video games as a means to try and make money. He ends up being approached by Fazbear Entertainment to try and make 4 games based on their long-standing history. Although Steve initially refuses, he at one point wakes up from a supposed coma to see he has a wife and 2 kids, and furthermore, debt he needs to get them all out of. So he takes the deal Fazbear Entertainment was offering him. He ends up making 3 games and starts the 4th, but Steve is actually killed before he could finish that one. He ends up finding out that his wife and kids are actually robots, and although he's willing to accept the false reality as, well, real, his wife stabs him repeatedly and kills him. That leaves us with 3 finished games and 1 half-baked game, our in-universe equivalent to FNAF 4. And this is especially interesting, as it explains why there's no finished version of FNAF 4 in the Help Wanted game. You instead have Night Terrors, a collection of minigames that sort of give off FNAF 4 vibes. But if Fazbear Entertainment had that unfinished product, it makes sense that they would be able to use what was there to make their game. To Help Wanted players, FNAF 4 content would seem brand new, but this was also unsatisfying to me for a different reason. If Steve Snodgrass is dead, why on earth would Fazbear Entertainment put his face in their VR game? The short and simple answer? I don't think it's him. Regardless of whether or not Steve made a completed FNAF 4, it doesn't explain why there are minigames based on sister location. I suspect that the rogue indie developer mentioned in FNAF VR was a second developer, Steve's replacement once they found out they couldn't control him. They probably gave him the 3 finished games and FNaF 4 and asked him to make a 5th. That results in Sister Location. However, Sister Location is so stylistically different, it doesn't end up making it into Help Wanted. Regardless, this developer is then given the credit for all the games that Snodgrass made. I say this is my explanation because I don't think Fazbear Entertainment would be stupid enough to actually include a dead guy's face in their game, calling him a lunatic and a liar, after his mysterious death by stabbing in a remote cottage in the country. But why do I bring all this up in the first place? Because it presents us with a pretty big problem. Steve Snodgrass, when he was hired, didn't want anything to do with Fazbear Entertainment. He didn't feel comfortable making games based on real events, but he ended up caving. This is a man who had no prior connection to Faz End, but even still, he somehow knew what the nightmares looked like, so Silver Parasol could recreate them in Help Wanted. So how is this possible? The short answer? He's the designer. He made the nightmare animatronic designs for his own game. He could just never fully implement them. With that in mind, the answer seems simple enough. The nightmare animatronics aren't real animatronics. They're based on stories about the crying child having nightmares leading up to his death. A pretty open and shut case. But still, one piece of evidence contradicts this hard, that being the return of the survival logbook. Despite digging through Steve Snodgrass's dirty laundry, there's still no clear indication as to why Michael would know what Nightmare Fredbear looks like. The survival logbook clearly indicates he's having nightmares featuring this character, so is there anything else we can glean from it? Well, in trying to mangle this piece of evidence into my current working theory, I came up with this. I believe Michael Afton was having nightmares, specifically of Nightmare Fredbear. This was his own monster that came for him in his sleep. Although he wasn't real, he was by all accounts traumatizing enough to Michael that the image of him stuck, being drawn later when a spirit asked him what his dreams had been like. Whether that spirit was relevant to the dreams or not is important for our discussion. Fast forward years later, Steve Snodgrass is looking to make the 4th game in the series, but he's running out of source material. But he does have the survival logbook left over by Mike Schmidt. Given that he based the 1st game in his series off this guy, it only made sense to read into more of what he had to say. So he looks, and he finds this picture of a monstrous robot bear. And at that moment, Steve knew what the main antagonist of his 4th game had to be. So after making Nightmare Fredbear, Steve knew he had to make a monstrous supporting cast, and he got to work, designing Nightmare Balloon Boy, Nightmarion, and Plushtrap to start, along with the Freddles that he'd use for a later character. Then he made Nightmare Bonnie, Nightmare Chica, and Nightmare Foxy, along with their variants Jacko Bonnie, Jacko Chica, and Jacko Foxy, although in Help Wanted, this one would be known as Grimm Foxy. Before he could finish the game though, he's dead, and Fazbear Entertainment swoops in to pick up where he left off. However, the developer they handed off to can't really finish FNaF 4, and thus just makes a new game, Sister Location. Faz End then hands off the unfinished FNaF 4 to Silver Parasol, who morphs parts of it into their main game through the Night Terror segments, and throws the rest of it in as part of the spooky DLC they were making. In short, FNaF 4 to them was an afterthought. So does that solve it? Well, kind of. If we consider that the survival logbook is something that probably existed in canon, then it makes sense Faz End would give it to Steve for development for his 4th game, from which he'd pull Mike's drawings to make the Nightmare animatronics. So technically, yes, Michael would have dreamt up Nightmare Fredbear, but FNaF 4 is still about the crying child. It's a recreation of events that happened to him, redesigned by Steve Snodgrass using Mike's drawings as a source of inspiration. You can even tell Steve made his own modifications to Mike's original design, giving Nightmare Fredbear a top hat where Mike's drawing didn't have that. In fact, if I'm right about this, that means another specific character is also a totally original character created by Steve. Nightmarion. The Nightmarion staff bots, the Nightmarion plushies all over the Mega Pizzaplex, they'd all tie back into him now, begging the question, why? The nightmares of all the animatronics being the fictional ones is not new information. It's pretty much always been believed that in universe they weren't real, but this changes a lot. I'd say we have more mysteries yet, specifically surrounding the developer of FNaF 4, this other developer who would have made Sister Location, and once again, why there's so many damn Nightmarion references in Security Breach. Until next time, I'm DMuted. Be sure to like and subscribe, it's completely free and you can opt out whenever you want. It just helps me out a lot. Thanks for watching. Peace.